Hi guys, my name is Rhal, I'm 21 years old, and for those of you who know me, it won't surprise you when I say that I am a drug user. Today, I'm going to suggest something a bit unusual, that as I am a drug user, so are the vast majority of you here today. So let's do a little experiment. Could you please raise your hand if you use recreational drugs on a fairly regular basis? Come on, don't be shy, I won't tell the police, I promise. Okay, a few of you, but clearly not a majority. Now, could you please raise your hand if you like to drink occasionally, have coffees in the morning, or smoke? Okay, so almost everyone here. By answering yes to the second question, you were inadvertently answering yes to the first, as of course, all of these substances are drugs as well. The vast majority of you here today are, in fact, drug users. Today, I want to offer a synopsis of our current drug use. Why do we use drugs, and what are their effects on us? The disparities from my questions at the start shows that we have a problem of gauging drug use in society. Cocaine is just as much a drug as alcohol is, and we need to move to a situation where we embrace the evidence around human drugs use, rather than denying its existence. So, let's start off with a bit of history. It's difficult to look back in the past and see any human civilization in which there were no drugs present. Evidence has been found of Neolithic peoples in modern-day Italy cultivating opium poppies over 7,000 years ago. In Central America, Native American tribes have used the drug mescaline, extracted from the local cactus peyote, again for thousands of years. Many of them still use it in their spiritual ceremonies today. But what of today's society? One might say, well, yes, some people use drugs, but to describe it, drug use as endemic would be a bit of an overkill. The vast majority of you do not. However, that's because when you think of a drug, you think solely of illicit drugs. So let's set the record straight. What actually is a psychoactive drug? Well, Science Daily describes it as, quote, a chemical substance that alters brain function, resulting in temporary changes in perception, mood, consciousness, and behavior. So let's use the responses from my second question at the start again. This morning, when you had a couple of espressos to pick you up and heighten your state of consciousness, or last evening, when you went down to the pub with some friends and had a couple of pints to unwind and distress from a very difficult week, you were using a drug, albeit a legal one. It doesn't really matter whether you're tipsy or running off a caffeine buzz or high off cannabis. All of these are psychoactive effects. You know, I always find it really funny when I meet people who are quite highly anti-drugs, because more often than not, they tend to be people who enjoy alcohol quite a bit. When I point out the obvious contradiction, I'm usually met with, oh man, it's just not a drug, it's drink, it's safe, it's legal. And then I find them the next morning slumped out on a bench with a splitting headache, asking me how they got here, much like our friend over here. It's ridiculous. Just because alcohol is legal, people look past its blatant psychoactive effects to regard it as something else entirely. Scientifically, it is a cast iron fact that alcohol is a drug. Now, I realize this is quite a cultural stumbling block to get past. Ever since you were young, all sources of authority have defined recreational drugs as a largely dangerous category of substances, while advancing the idea that alcohol is not. Your parents, teachers, even health charities say the same thing. Governments will threaten to lock you up and give you a criminal record for life if you dare to possess them. You may not think you use drugs, because when you think of the word drug, you think of other words such as problem or abuse. Injection-laden addicts and criminals is what you tend to think of. But when you think of alcohol, you think of something fun, something free-flowing, something that really has very few negative externalities at all. We've come to the very dangerous situation where we equate legality with safety and illegality with danger. In fact, the reasons people use a legal substance such as alcohol aren't particularly different to the reasons people use illicit substances. Ask yourselves for a moment, why do you drink? Fundamentally, what does it do for you? Well, for the vast majority of people, it detaches you from reality for a while, allows you to have fun and de-stress, and is largely the same reason why people use a drug like cannabis. It allows for the releasing of certain neurotransmitters such as serotonin and dopamine, which causes small feelings of euphoria. Now ask yourselves, what does watching a film do for you? What does listening to a great piece of music do? What does playing Call of Duty ultimately do for you? All of these activities detach the user from reality for a certain amount of time, while also releasing neurotransmitters such as serotonin and dopamine. It sounds vaguely familiar, doesn't it? And that's because ultimately it is. Whereas the drug user gets these feelings triggered by an outside substance, the hobbyist gets these feelings triggered by a certain behavior or activity. When we ask ourselves why we use drugs, we should also ask ourselves why we do any of these ultimately superfluous things. Why, since the dawn of agriculture, and in an age where we have more and more free time, have these activities become more prevalent? It's noticeable that as the inescapable threat of death has receded from the human psyche, we have required more and more things to distract ourselves from reality, whether it's having a pint on the weekend or playing video games. Recreational drug use is nothing to be surprised by, and is partly the reason why there have been almost no human societies in history which have not been present. So, is it right we prescribe all of our legal and cultural bias to a few substances over a host of others? If we accept that humans will always use drugs, is this a sensible policy that brings about good outcomes? Let's look at humans' consumption of alcohol and see what we find. In 2010, the World Health Organization estimated that per capita alcohol consumption in the UK for those aged above the age of 15 was 11.6 litres. Now that's pure alcohol, mind you, roughly the equivalent of 30 individual litre bottles of vodka, a staggering total, which is emblematic of our wide societal uses for it. So what does this cause? Well, firstly, let's look at crime. In the 2013-14 Crime Survey of England and Wales, it was estimated that 53% of violent crime involved alcohol. Now that equates to 704,000 individual crimes committed under the influence. Think of domestic violence, assault, grievous bodily harm. Almost half of these crimes in England and Wales involve alcohol in some form. What do you see when you go out to Smack or Neon in Leamington or the clubs or bars of any major British city? Significant amounts of manpower from the emergency services are required to keep large swathes of drunk people safe and secure. Many of them are in the audience right now. Think of the effect this has on police men and women. A 2013 report found that 89% of police officers in the Northeast had been subject to an alcohol-related assault. 89%. Another report found that 53% of all police time was taken up by alcohol-related casework. Now that's time that couldn't be spent tackling rapes, robberies, and murders. What of its negative health effects? Well, this is where it's going to really shock you. 3.3 million. That's the figure that denotes the World Health Organization's estimate of annual alcohol-related deaths calculated in 2012. So every single year, we have more people dying from alcohol-related causes than died in the entirety of the Korean and Vietnam Wars combined. In 2016, there were 7,327 individual deaths in the UK ascribed to alcohol-related causes. That's roughly 20 per day. While getting drunk can be fun, this is the dark side of alcohol that has been largely kept from the public, one which arguably makes it the most deadly drug in not even the UK, but possibly the world. Now, from news reports, you'd probably think illicit drugs must be worse than this, right? Well, let's take a look at one, cannabis or weed, and see what we find. Does it cause crime and deaths? Well, generally, no, it doesn't. what do you really experience on the drug? Well, most people are glued to their sofas and want to listen to soothing music, right? In fact, when was the last time you heard of a report of a group of high people engaged in fistfights and humping anything that moved? There have been many reports on the link between cannabis and violence, and there have been no conclusive evidence between a correlation of the two. From anecdotal evidence, we can clearly see that the violence associated with alcohol is clearly not prevalent to the same extent with cannabis. What of its negative health effects? Well, in this case, there's really no contest. It's extremely difficult to kill yourself from weed intoxication. The Drug Enforcement Administration of the US, the DEA, estimated it would take 1,500 pounds of cannabis, theoretically smoked in 15 minutes, to make you overdose. That's roughly the equivalent of 20,000 spliffs. That's a lot of cannabis, even for a student like myself. They went on to say that there has never been a recorded example of cannabis overdose. So what about another commonly floated alternative, MDMA? Again, for crime and violence, the substance seems to have few negative externalities. Users of the drug are often induced into hippie, lovey-type utopias where all they want to do is embrace and dance with other people. The few reports of violence reported around the substance often involve other outside substances such as amphetamines or speed, masquerading as MDMA. Based on this, you may think, yeah, let's just get rid of alcohol and go headfirst for MDMA. Instead of judging drinks by alcoholic strength, you could judge them by milligrams of MDMA instead. Instead of selling packs of cigarettes, you could sell packs of spliffs. We could then have all of the benefits around drug use without their negative consequences. Unfortunately, even though this is a nice idea, it's largely a red herring, as you can never wholly get rid of the dangers associated with drug use. Indeed, studies have reported that long-term heavy MDMA usage damages certain functions of the brain whilst also permanently reducing brain serotonin levels. Long-term cannabis use has been linked to a level of dependency in some subjects. To assume all of the facts of a substance without knowing all of the scientific facts for sure would be to commit the same blunders that our lawmakers have made in their tacit acceptance of alcohol as our societal drug of choice. So where do we go from here? I'd suggest our society needs to do three things. Firstly, we need to accept that we are a society that is fueled by drugs. Whether it's a legal one like alcohol or an illegal one like MDMA, we humans love changing our mental perception of the world. Most people have the ability to use these substances in moderation, and we therefore need to separate recreational drug use from drug abuse. Secondly, we need to assess our drug use more. Just because a drug is legal does not mean it is harmless. We need to look at the relative harms of substances before we can come to a conclusion on how bad they are. This is a graph detailing the relative harms of different psychoactive drugs compiled by the revered scientist Dr. Nutt. In this study, he includes a host of criteria: risk of injury, loss of relationship, drug-related mortality, drug-specific mortality, risk of dependency. These are things we must consider when we look at how dangerous a drug is, in the hope that we can better tackle those dangers. Thirdly, we need to boldly consider alternatives to our current drug of choice, alcohol. Its negative effects are particularly raw, both to the user but also to society as well. It is mad that we have set a largely arbitrary line on what substances are and are not permissible in our society, devoid of any semblance of fact or rationale. By assessing alternatives to alcohol in a scientific manner, we can hopefully reduce the extreme negative consequences it brings to our society. Above all, we need to question societal inertia and its distortion of fact. Drugs and alcohol are a good example, but there are so many more in society. Through analysing our drug use more, we can help people who abuse drugs reform their behaviour, whilst also leading recreational drug users to be more informed about the problems of their use. Instead of saying drugs and alcohol, try saying drugs including alcohol, and try not instantly judge someone who said they had a spliff last night, just like you wouldn't instantly judge someone who said they had a couple of pints down the pub. Through this sort of analysis, we can build a better, more cohesive society. Thank you very much.